This was an incredible case. Prosecutions, billions of dollars in funding, people went to jail, massive revolution in healthcare. And it started with a Google search.
I have always done my best for my patients and their family, despite the attacks on my character at the trial and much adverse publicity about me.
Ages ago, and I completely forgot about it, and I'm beyond that.
The trauma was not mine alone. I'm acutely aware that the trial and the events surrounding it and the appeals were also very painful for those involved in the events concerned.
Hedley Thomas is the Australian's national chief correspondent, and today we're launching Hedley's new podcast investigation, Sick to Death, about the case of the original Dr. Death, a surgeon who worked in Queensland in the 2000s called Dr. Jayant Patel. He was ultimately found by a commission of inquiry to have played a role in the deaths of several patients. He was convicted of charges including manslaughter, but those convictions were ultimately quashed by the High Court. He pleaded guilty to several counts of fraud in relation to his medical qualifications and was barred from practicing ever again in Australia. We encountered Jayant Patel in Portland, Oregon, where he now lives, and he said that he's forgotten it, that he's moved on and that he doesn't worry about that anymore. Hedley, what was your response to hearing that from Jayant Patel?
Well, I think he was trying to put a brave face on what must have been one of the most incredibly painful chapters in his life. A man with an oversized ego, very bombastic and confident and manipulative and dishonest surgeon who came to Australia having lied about his background in the United States, having lied about the negligence and the investigations that led to him being very severely disciplined and barred from practicing the surgery that he then decided that he would practice in Australia in a public hospital when he was welcomed with open arms. And when he said that, when he said he'd forgotten, well, do we ever forget something like that? Imagine his life was upended. The lives of many other people had been ended by his surgery, and he went to jail. He served time behind bars. So I don't think he was being truthful when he said he'd forgotten about it.
Your reporting on this in the 2000s in Brisbane revealed Jayant Patel to be someone who had a huge ego, who was very confident in his abilities, even though they didn't really exist at the level that he believed they did. His response now that he's forgotten it, he's moved on, he's very confident, he's happy with his life, does that fit with the Jayant Patel who you saw in his actions back then?
I doubt that he has truly been able to overcome the terrible loss to his reputation, to his standing, to his belief in himself, because he was ultimately, professionally and personally, put through the ringer, and I would say almost destroyed by the investigations that unfolded in Australia. They were very necessary investigations by health authorities and then prosecutions by Queensland prosecuting authorities, because Jayant Patel literally had blood on his hands. There were numerous patients who, according to the Commission of Inquiry's investigations, would not have died but for Dr. Patel's negligence, his terrible judgment, and then his concealment of his negligence and errors. And there had to be accountability for that.
This story was absolutely enormous. It went around the world and, of course, it captivated Australians. And I think it shook some of our faith in the health system that we do like to trust. But your work at the Brisbane Courier-Mail at the time started, like a lot of stories do, with something very simple, a Google search. Tell me about the genesis of the story and what did you Google?
Yeah, well, back then, Claire, it was April 2005 and smartphones were something, I don't think we actually knew of. We used mobile phones, sure, but they didn't have the capacity for internet and, downloads of big data files. So I had been in Bundaberg, this regional city, a short flight from Brisbane. I'd gone up there to investigate the concerns of a nurse who had been in touch with me, Tony Hoffman. This nurse had told me about a surgeon that she said was dangerous, was killing patients. She had tried to raised the alarm about him. She had gone to the hospital's heads about it. She said that the doctors called him Dr. Death behind his back. They said, if anything happens to us or to any member of our family and we need surgery, do not let him operate on me or my wife and children. So the other surgeons were aware of Dr. Patel's incompetence. However, he was still allowed to operate. This hospital had long waiting lists. Administrators were under a lot of pressure to reduce the waiting lists. And as an overseas trained surgeon who had been given the title Director of Surgery, the hospital's heads just flattered and looked after him. So I had been in Bundaberg for a couple of days listening to the accounts of nurses who I met confidentially. They told me about these incredible stories of Dr. Patel's behaviour. He refused to wash his hands. The infection control was uncontrolled. I mean, there were nurses who were running after him, trying to make surfaces sterile again because he was touching wounds and patients and moving from patient to patient without washing hands. But it was his inability, his negligence with the scalpel that was of greatest concern. And that's where Tony Hoffman saw all these injuries and saw the patients in intensive care afterwards. And a lot didn't make it. But after I had been there a couple of days, and it was my last night in Bundaberg, I was talking to a nurse called Karen Jenner, and she said to me, of course, Dr. Patel didn't become a bad surgeon overnight. Now, it's a pretty simple comment, and I guess I just heard it, and it just started to ring alarm bells in my mind. And I asked her, what do you mean by that? I felt like I was on the edge of understanding what she meant, but I needed her to confirm it. And she said, well, he's in his 50s. He's been practicing surgery for a long time. He didn't become this bad overnight. And I said in front of Tony and Karen and the other nurses who had taken a big risk after their shifts to come and talk to me, I said, so do you mean that where he's practiced previously, there's probably going to be similar issues? There'll be a trail of problems and badly damaged patients where he's previously worked. And they all said, yeah, absolutely. That's right. That's what there'll be. And I couldn't sleep that night in this little budget motel in Bundaberg because I kept thinking about that comment and what it possibly meant. And the next day I flew back to Brisbane, and as I said, we didn't have smartphones, so I had to go back to my desk in the newspaper building. I wanted to go straight home. It had been a difficult assignment, but instead I went to my desk to perform that online check. It was a Google search. I literally Googled Dr. Jayant Patel and disciplinary history, or words to that effect, and after a millisecond, up it came. It was on the first screen of hits, and this was probably before everyone did Google searches on all their former boyfriends and girlfriends and what have you.
Or surgeons who they were recruiting to come and work in hospitals.
That's right. And a PDF with the details of Dr. Patel's disciplinary record and the findings against him in Portland in the United States and in New York State suddenly appeared. And I realized, holy crap. And that day, well, that night, we scrambled to remake the front page and write a feature article about it with the headline, "Why Didn't They Check?" And that was the catalyst for the inquiry and just the venting of an enormous amount of public outrage and concern, because suddenly we realised, after 2 years of concerns and complaints being raised by the nurses and then being told, just you go back to doing what you do best, leave the important stuff to the doctors and surgeons, there was proof he should never have been employed.
You went on to win the Gold Walkley twice, Australia's highest honour for journalism. You're one of the world's most respected investigative journos. Did that experience of Googling something that I think as a journalist, you might have thought, oh, of course they would have checked that. Of course people would have checked that. Teach you something about asking those basic questions that you might assume have already been answered?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I, as a journalist, 2 years after Patel's employment at Bundaberg Hospital, 2 years in which he's been the subject of internal complaints, and even there were even complaints made and issues raised in the state parliament, and I'm the first person to discover that he's got this terrible record in the United States, which meant that he shouldn't have been employed to repair a cut finger, let alone, do esophagectomy and other very serious operations. It just underlines why journalism can make such a powerful difference, because sometimes people don't do the most obvious things, and we need to come along and keep doing those and asking questions.
And then you rang me back a few minutes later and you said to me, we've got him. You said to me, you're all right, Tony, you're okay. We've got him. I don't know if we both started crying, but I know I certainly was crying. It changed everything. We knew now that he wouldn't get his 5-year contract and all hell would break loose.
Something that's a characteristic of your journalism is forming relationships of deep trust and friendships, really, with whistleblowers and sources. In this case, it's Tony Hoffman, the nurse who you spoke about, who's carried a very heavy burden from being the person who blew the whistle on Jayant Patel. Before you came into the story, she had really been ignored, overlooked, almost punished for trying to blow the whistle. You've done a lovely interview with Tony as part of this series where she talks about your first face-to-face meeting, where she was very emotional. She was very worried, she was very afraid, but she was trying to get you to trust her and to believe that even though she was very upset, she was telling the truth. That's a really interesting dynamic, isn't it? The journo who needs to be able to trust your sources, but often people who blow the whistle are, because of the trauma of doing that, very emotional. They seem that they might not be credible. Did you know from the start that you could trust Tony?
I had a gut feeling that I could trust Tony, but we were wary of each other. And often that's the start of a relationship with your source or whistleblowing contact. You're really trying to work out what the potential weaknesses are and whether the person looks like they've lost their marbles because of the fact they've been trying to blow the whistle about something of great importance and public interest for a long time and no one's listening, or whether they've lost their marbles and they're just making stuff up. And with Tony Hoffman, I believed her because I had myself done quite a lot of reporting before meeting Tony about Queensland Health, and I was aware of the incredibly deceptive and downright dishonest conduct of senior people in Queensland Health in covering up big problems. I'd also done a lot of reporting on the challenges facing patients and health administrators when it came to overseas trained doctors. Australia had and still has a great shortage of doctors, so we were importing doctors from overseas. We needed them, particularly in areas of need, rural and regional areas, and Queensland needed them more than anywhere at that time. But we were not properly vetting the doctors, and I had done a series of stories back in that period, shortly before I broke the Patel story, and that series focused on how overseas trained doctors without proper credentials, who hadn't been checked out thoroughly and had been given jobs of responsibility, had caused a lot of harm, and it was being swept under the rug. And I remember when I started writing those stories and asking questions to develop those stories, getting some raised eyebrows from people and, having to sort of answer their questions about whether this was some kind of racist line in reporting, where we were attacking the overseas trained doctors, many of whom were from countries like India and Pakistan and so on, because they weren't white. And nothing could be further from the truth. It was about upholding standards of care and ensuring that the Australian public was protected. But what we discovered as a result of the inquiries that were held after the Patel scandal really blew up was that in Queensland, we were not just getting doctors from overseas who were incompetent. We were employing people who pretended to be doctors, one of whom was a Russian fellow who had no experience in psychiatry and had been employed as a psychiatric registrar and had done a lot of damage to the patients by telling them all they didn't need their medication. And he got away with this for a long time. And a number of psychiatrists who assessed him said, we thought he was pretty good. He'd never been to medical school.
We've worked together at The Australian for years now, and we've made quite a few of your big investigations. We always seem to do it the hard way. I think that's your fault. And in this one, we've brought this story to life with nearly 200 voice actors, a beautiful production led by our audio lead Jasper Leake and supported by producers Kristen Amiot, Stephanie Coombs and Leah Tamaglu. It sounds absolutely beautiful. You and I have talked a lot over the years about why audio is a great way to tell big stories like this, long stories like this. What do you think it is about Sick to Death that lends itself to a listen rather than a read?
It's a chilling story, and there's intimacy and partnership in the telling of it. And the stories that I tell in the book that I wrote, Sick to Death, after this scandal, which, is 20 years ago, is a searing account of some of the most appalling conduct, surgically, politically, bureaucratically, even legally, that you could ever imagine. And, for a journalist who, back in 2005, I was 38, I was probably, well cynical by then, but I wasn't prepared for what was uncovered in that saga. The taking of data about terrible problems in the public health system by politicians into the cabinet room so they wouldn't have to release it for years. The brazen lying about the damage done to patients, about waiting lists and so on. It was appalling. And we were able to lift the lid on that as a result of this crisis surrounding a doctor, Patel, in a regional hospital, which just then widened into a massive and, I think, very important investigation of the entire health system. And it showed what can be made possible when you start with something small and, the damage and the ripples go out, and then you have an opportunity to reform, to learn lessons, to deliver much needed funding, to tighten procedures, to drive out those people, whether they're bad doctors, bad bureaucrats, who have caused the system to fail. And these lessons are still around today, Claire. Some things have changed for the better, some things haven't, and we need to be constantly reminded of this. I am in no doubt that across Australia today, there will be doctors, surgeons, and people pretending to be doctors who shouldn't be there, who are incompetent or fraudulent, who are just imposters. And we have to be always vigilant about that.
Well, Sick to Death is live now at sicktodeathpodcast.com, at The Australians app and at Apple Podcasts, where you can just search Sick to Death and link your subscription. Hedley, thank you very much. I can't wait to listen.
Thank you, Claire.